We're getting into the final stages of hull prep on this PT-11. Last time I did this little fillet down at the gunnel. I installed that fillet and filled a few other areas like these bulkhead slots and a couple other minor areas like the transom. Excuse my voice. I've just lightly sanded these areas to prepare for fiberglass, which will happen at some point in the future. But I just wanted to show you where we are. Basically all the seams are filled, maybe a little minor work to do there. The transom, I filled the little gap between the hull planks and the transom. Look down the hull from the top. It's a good looking hull. I'm really happy with it. I went over this hull one more time, just kind of went over it closely once or twice around with a little bucket of thickened epoxy fairing material. I just looked for any low spots in the chines, and like at the transom here, and I just filled bulkhead slots, a few spots in the chines, places where it was just a little low, just wanted to touch it up one last round. Up here at the bow, we have something new. This is a little tunnel that will contain a painter for towing. Goes right through. It's glassed in place on the inside, epoxied and glassed, so that the boat can tow from down near the waterline. But just a quick once over. The seams are all in good shape, but there were just a few little low spots. Needed another touch-up of epoxy to bring it up to where I want it before this boat thinks about getting glassed. I cut the boat in half, but I still need to be sure that the two halves line up properly. So my first step was to reconnect the boat. It's the first time it's been back together since it was cut. And it's kind of nice to see it all in one piece again for the first time. This is the starboard side, reconnected. Seam looks pretty good. So my next step now is to fair across the seam as needed. It's not going to need much. It's pretty smooth, as it should be. It didn't take much sanding to get this hull where I wanted it to be at this point. I did a little bit of touch-up across the cut seam here, just to make sure that's faired in well. It really didn't take much. Just made sure it was nice and smooth and even going across. Real happy with it. It looks good. The seam's very tight. Just a pencil line, really. Really couldn't ask for anything more than that. And then I just gave the rest of the hull a quick once over. It already was pretty much there, but quick hand sand all over both sides to get it ready. This is an advantage to having kind of done this incrementally as I went. So that all this fairing and stuff was already done. I don't see any reason to have left it any longer in the process. Anytime I filled holes or any of that, I cleaned this up, made sure it stayed nice the whole time. And so I made this final prep before glassing very straightforward. But I'm real happy with that seam. Everything's aligned. As I said, it was just a quick sand across with a fairing block, just to even up the slightest inconsistencies. But it's in good shape. I'm happy with it. So then I laid out these pieces of cloth. They're 6 feet long and 24 inches wide, half the width of a roll. And I laid them out as called for in the book. Up here at the bow, these pieces wrap around and overlap, and then I folded them back like this. Again, as directed. And these will get wet out in place. Each of these layers overlaps the bottom panel by at least an inch, On the stern half, it's basically an inch all around. On the bow half, they get a little wider up here towards the stem. And you can see how they're going to overlap. And that'll double up the cloth right here in the knuckle, or whatever you want to call it, which is a good thing, because that'll provide some extra wear resistance for a part of the dinghy that's going to be running into shorelines and so forth. So I'll wet this cloth out in place, just as you see it. A few push pins that hold it in place temporarily. Once I get it started to stick to the hull with the resin, I'll take those out. And then the second stage of this will be another layer of cloth that covers the bottom. Actually, 2 layers. There's a layer of 4 ounce and a layer of 6 ounce. 6 ounce goes on first, then the 4 ounce. And those are over there, sitting on that sawhorse ready to go. But that'll be a separate day, because they're going to overlap these pieces by a bit. And to create a clean line, I'll put tape on this when it's cured and run the fiberglass to that. You'll see that later. Anyway, this is the beginning of sheathing. This is a big step, and I'll show you more once it's done. A couple hours later, and the sheathing on the hull is done for the moment. There's going to be a fill coat later today, but the glass is installed. Looks good. Glass starts roughly an inch up on the bottom, wraps down and over this gunnel. Up here at the bow, the 2 layers of cloth overlap one another, starting roughly a foot back from the cutwater. And then each layer wraps around the stem by about an inch onto the other side. And then on top of that, there are 2 layers of 4 ounce cloth, seen here with the ugly black markings on the side. And those cover the whole stem as well. So there's 4 layers of cloth on this stem. Pretty strong. Went right over the towing hole. That'll get cut out later. But that's the bow section. And the stern doesn't have anything fancy, just the 1 layer of 6 ounce here. Again, about an inch up on the bottom, and then down over the gunnel. At the transom edge here, this is rounded over previously, and the cloth is cut about a 1/2 inch and then rounded and then wet out over this corner. Later, the transom glass will cover this. So this wraps over the corner. And the other side of the stern here. The bottom panel is going to get covered tomorrow in a later step. It's going to be fiberglass separately. So here's the stern. So this looks good. In the afternoon, the fiberglass was cured enough so I could go ahead with this fill coat. And this looks kind of funny because it's mixed with a heavy amount of 410 microlite filler. In this case, I mixed it 50% by volume with the filler. So my batch of epoxy was like 8 ounces, so I put in 4 ounces by volume of the filler. And then I applied it with a 1/4 inch nap mohair roller and smoothed it out with a foam roller. And this put on a nice heavy coat of this stuff. Hoping it'll fill the weave enough in this one coat. Can still see a little bit, but I'm hoping that once it gets sanded, it'll kind of disappear. But putting that stuff in there, it was pretty easy to roll out with the 1/4 inch roller to get the product on the boat. And then the foam roller over the top to smooth it out, kind of tip it out with the roller. And it seems to have worked pretty well. And the other advantage of doing this is that the 410 helps prevent runs and sags. It holds the epoxy on there much better. So even if I have to fill coat again, I have to worry a lot less about messing around with runs or problems with the epoxy, and this will be way easier to sand. If I have to do another one, it's certainly not the end of the world. but it's really leveled out to a gloss, even with all that filler in there. I'm pretty impressed with this. It's really almost like rolling on a liquid fairing compound. The next day, and it's day 2 for hull sheathing. And I started this day by lightly sanding these areas where the cloth overlapped the top, just to kind of ease that edge there a little bit. And I sanded down a little bit on the hull because that new glass is going to overlap. Also trimmed and sanded the outside face of the gunnels so I can glass those. The fill coat looks pretty good. It's too soon to sand it, and anyway I want to keep glassing, so I'm not sure how it came out yet. You can still see some weave of the cloth through it, but only sanding will really tell the tale. So I'll get to that after the glassing's done on the bottom here. I sanded that dagger board trunk, the fiberglass, so that's nice and flush. And I'm going to glass right over that, cut it out later. So I've got the glass all cut. I'm going to lay that out next. I've cleaned this up, sanded the transom here where it wraps over because the transom glass will cover that. You can see where I've sanded about to here. And I'm going to run a strip of tape that'll be the defining edge of the bottom fiberglass. I'll run the glass kind of over it and then it'll get cut off later. Again, trimmed these gunnels back, sanded the outsides flush with the new glass. After a few hours work, the glassing is done. Did both the gunnels and the bottom. Let's start up here on the bottom. The bow section, there's a layer of 6-ounce cloth in 2 pieces because it's not long enough to go the whole length. So there's a seam up here and a little piece extends out to the knuckle right there. And then there's a 4-ounce piece of cloth over the aft half, ends right about here. And this forward part has like 3 layers of 6-ounce on it because of the way the hull sides overlapped. That's why this 4-ounce doesn't extend any further. So that just gives the bottom some extra strength and impact resistance, which will make sense for a dinghy that's going on shore. So there's the bow section. I ran it down 1 1/4 inches down from the chine right there. I marked that and put some tape on there before I put the glass on. Wet the glass out right over the tape and then trimmed it down to this edge here that you see. And that'll get faired in a little bit later. Stern section was basically the same. Layer of 6-ounce in 2 pieces, and then a layer of 4-ounce extending from the bulkhead back as far as it goes, which is right here. And again, 1 1/4 down from the chine, overlapping the glass on the side of the hull. Marked with tape, and then I cut the fiberglass right above the tape when it was still wet. So there's the bottom. I went right over the dagger board trunk. You can see it way up there. And I'll cut that out later. The transom has 1 layer of 6-ounce on it that wraps slightly over the edge at the top, sides, and bottom. It might look a little ragged, but it'll get faired and cleaned up later after fill codes and so forth. So once I had the bottom glass done, I installed glass on these gunnels. The stern section here, and these look terrible at the moment because of the loose threads and all this garbage. It's miserable to work with these strips. But this aft section has a layer of unidirectional fabric and then a layer of 6-ounce over the top. So 2 layers. The uni is pretty heavy stuff. I don't quite know why it's needed, but that was for the boat designer to figure out, not me. So that's the stern section. Wet out in place. Obviously that'll get trimmed later. And then the bow section has 2 layers of 6-ounce cloth only. which looks more normal because the 6-ounce cloth becomes so transparent when you wet it out. The unidirectional fabric, like most heavy fabrics, doesn't become quite as transparent when you wet it out, but it is completely wet. And the 6-ounce on top is completely wet. And again, this looks absolutely atrocious at the moment, but it's stuck well to the gunnel top and bottom edge, which is what it needs to do. It's not trying to wrap over or anything. And this bow section wraps right around the stem. And I kept it tight here at the stem. Where's my finger? There it is. And pushed it into this little notch where the gunnel fades into the stem. And the other side's the same, obviously. And the same on the stern section. This wasn't too bad to put on. I'd kind of been concerned about it, given the threads and the unidirectional fabric. Not sure how that was going to go on, but it actually wasn't too bad to do these gunnels. I was just really careful when I rolled to avoid catching these strings, which isn't the easiest thing, but when they got in the way, I just kind of threw them into the kind of the interior like you see here. Just get them out of the way so I can roll. Where I did sand earlier, it doesn't look too bad, but there's still some texture showing, I think. So I'll probably have to do another fill coat. So there's your hull bottom and gunnels. Later in the same day, I fill coated the transom and the bottom panels where I glassed earlier today. This is the same mix using 410 fairing filler and with the epoxy, 50% by volume. Transom, coated these edges where it wraps over. And I coated underneath where it wraps over as much as I could. And then a good heavy coat on these flat panels and the little 1-inch overlap. Both the stern and the bow sections. Daggerboard trunk is still glassed over. That'll get cut out later. I'm going to do another fill coat on the entire hull next time. It'll require a light sanding of the entire hull, and then I'm going to do one more of these fill coats with the filler in it over the whole thing, so it'll be nice and smooth and glossy. It's the next morning, and I started off by trimming off excess fiberglass from these gunnels and from the two edges of the hull here on the bottom. Then I lightly sanded these transitions where that glass lays over. Lightly sanded that just to remove any kind of hard edge. And then I sanded the whole boat pretty lightly just to get the gloss off and start to flatten it, because I'm going to do a second fill coat on all of this. So in order for the fill coat to work, I had to sand the whole first fill coat, but again, just lightly to get the gloss off. I sanded these transitions where the glass wraps over from the transom. And sanded this whole hull again. 80 grit, mostly on a palm sander, by hand on the chines and any corners. I trimmed these gunnels down, but the final flattening of this edge will happen later. I just trimmed the glass. I didn't try to sand it flush top or bottom. Those are going to get fill coated as well. Next, I applied a small amount of filler made with that 410 and Cabosil to a few of these areas where the glass overlaps, like here at the transom, just to ease that transition. And then up along the bottom, especially where that bottom fiberglass overlapped the fiberglass on the hull sides. So that just is a very, very light coat just to fill that little space. It's like a 1/16 of an inch where that glass overlaps or something like that. So I did that on both halves of the hull. Up here at the stem, I added some filler where those stem pieces overlap. Again, just to start easing that. If I have to fair this out more later, I can. But there's going to be a second fill coat going on in a few hours once this stuff cures enough to kind of work over the top. Now the second fill coat's on the hull. I waited a few hours after applying that fairing compound up here. And when that was tacky to the touch, then I went ahead with the second fill coat, which I did the same way that I've done before with the 50% 410 mixed in. This one rolled out pretty nice. Definitely goes on a little more smoothly over the first fill coat than it did over the glass itself. So that was kind of nice. And you know, it's not perfect. It's not ready for finish, but it's smooth and even. A little bit of roller stipple, but that can't be helped. A few pieces of junk in there, like bits of roller right there. But that'll all be sanded out later. But I'm really happy with it. The hull looks great underneath it. Everything's nice and fair. This ought to sand up really well and give me a nice finish to go for primer and paint after this. Did the gunnel faces as well. Just a quick fill coat on those. Those will ultimately be covered with a rub rail. So that's not going to be that visible, but it's still fill coated. But I do like the look of this so far. The second fill coat was totally worth it. I had hoped maybe one coat would do enough with the filler mixed in, but it really wasn't enough. And this was totally worth the fairly minimal effort involved. It's going to make the hull really nice when it's sanded. Transom. This is the last major step on the exterior of the hull, other than sanding it and painting. So we're going to end this video with this stage right here, and I'll pick up the hull progress a little bit later when it's time to prime and paint and some of the related work to that.